We're going to be having an agronomist panel, considerations when planning crop rotation. We have three presenters here today. I'm going to just introduce everybody at the start, and then we'll bring each person up. One person is virtual, and that's who we're going to start with. Kory van Damme. He's the owner, agronomist of Fortified Agronomy. His company started in 2017, and when he decided to move on from what he was doing in the past and start his own company, he currently has 2 additional full-time agronomists and usually 2 to 3 seasonal workers. He started his career when he graduated in Assiniboine Community College in 2005 and 2006. Started his career in agriculture at Damme Farm Supplies in Pilot Mound in the summers of 04 and 05. And he wanted to thank his dad for getting his foot in the door, so that's kind of nice. In the fall of 2005, he had the opportunity to join Wade Barnes and Curtis McKinnon in their new company called Farmer's Edge. Some of you may be familiar with that, based in the Pilot Mound area. And he was with them until 2017. Our second speaker is Liz Karpinchick. She is with Tone Ag Consulting and works as a consulting agronomist, working with farmers across Manitoba. She's a leader of the Tone Ag team that works together on nutrient management, soil testing, and crop rotation planning, as well as on-farm trials. Finally, we're going to finish off with Mr. Jason Voogt. And Jason is a co-owner and lead agronomist of Field Agronomy. He has 27 years of experience. Is that right, Jason? I thought it was more, but anyways. As an agronomist working for ag retail, he has 8 staff and 4 full-time agronomists and 4 summer scouts. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the virtual presentation, and I'm going to have Kory do his presentation, and we're going to save all the questions for the end. So,
attaboy. You're golden now.
Awesome.
Rock on.
Awesome. Okay, so I took the approach, I'm calling it last minute cropping changes, but this obviously is going to apply with all cropping changes. I just find that in the heat of the battle, maybe on a year like this year where things get delayed, we can make some pretty quick decisions, and it might be a little tough to cover all the bases. So I will go through a little bit on how I feel we do things, and whichever, feel free to ask questions obviously at the end. So some reasons that I find for people making changes, commodity price this year, late seeding, input costs went up or down, even so much as a gut feeling. Maybe you haven't seeded a crop before, thought it'd be a good idea, last minute, I don't feel so good about it. And then risk management. If it's a later seeded variety, things get late, maybe you might want to rethink that. So where to start? What questions should be asked? Probably my main one that is easy to overlook, but can be one of the biggest detrimental impacts on the next seeded crop. I'd say it'd be herbicides. So what we always have to ask ourselves is what was seeded there, or what was sprayed there or broadcast there in terms of herbicide the previous year. So something like Avidex or Edge, probably, for an example, shouldn't be seeding oats the next year. Not saying that you absolutely can't, but it's not on the label, and if you have an issue, you're all on your own. Same thing with cropolid, could have a detrimental impact on soybeans. Imazifer last year. This one I actually had an issue with personally. This was back in my probably 2006, 2007 year. Was pretty much used to wheat canola, where really didn't have any issues with this, and then we threw peas in the mix. Well, when I started seeing group 2 symptoms in the canola the following year, it wasn't really going to be a great conversation. I had a couple sleepless nights and had to break it to the grower that, you know what, we overlooked this, and now we could be facing some issues. We babysat it, and fortunately enough, we had enough rain the year before that, yeah, we saw issues, but it wasn't detrimental, and it actually turned out to be one of his best fields on the farm. So very fortunate for that, but I will never forget it. One way to obviously help with this, back then was all pen and paper, but now there's a lot of tools in the toolbox, is good record keeping. Lots, I'm sure there's lots of agronomy software out there. Back in like 2007, after this, I actually looked at a product called Field Recon, and now it's actually called Field X. And I'm able to save and store all my recommendations from year to year. Works well for me. I haven't ventured out to try anything else, so I definitely can't say it's the best, but I definitely do like the way it works. Another question, what are the fertilizer requirements? Do we have, what's the requirements of the intended crop that we're changing to? Is there too much already on or not enough? If there's too much, we get a late seeded year, we might just delay maturity on that crop that we decide to go to. So what are the issues with that? Obviously we just talked about lodging. That could be an issue, delayed maturity, and without having a crystal ball, we don't know if we're going to see an early frost, unfortunately. So just another thing to that we always think about. And then if we're doing having to put on more fertilizer, say we flip from soybeans going to canola, whichever, what's the additional cost of that, and how are we going to put the additional nitrogen or fertilizer down? Typically, I'm in a very big fall applied market. So once the anhydrous unit's unhooked for the fall, it gets hooked, the tractor gets hooked up to the drill next year and doesn't stop till the seeding's done. So we may need to figure out a way like broadcasting on the field before seeding, possibly. It can come with its challenges depending on rain and everything afterwards, but we definitely would have to choose the right product when we're doing that. So next, I'll show you an example. This was planned though. We didn't want to, this is a hilltop. We didn't want to fall NH3 on this, but just as an example, we used urea on this field. We did use a urease inhibitor, but unfortunately, after all the rain we had at the start of the year that pushed delayed seeding and whatnot, it didn't actually want to rain after that in a timely fashion to get the nitrogen in the ground. So normally they say we can lose up to 40–50%, even with the urease inhibitor on it. And after soil testing this fall, I think we lost a lot more, as you can see in the crops. So definitely, this is where the 4R would come into play. Gonna have to choose the right product. Maybe a Super U, I'm thinking would have helped us here, but without knowing that it wasn't going to rain after the monsoons that we had, we thought we were on the right track. Another thing we think about is diseases between the crops. Just an example, sclerotinia, canola, and sunflowers can go back and forth. Fusarium in wheat following grain corn. I haven't personally had an issue with that, but I have heard growers have had that as an issue. And if it was following a silage corn, I wouldn't suspect there would be an issue because all the material pretty much leaves the field. One other thing that I was blessed to having an issue with was corn after canola. Typically never see issues. And we had this on a manure field that had seen a lot of liquid dairy manure. Unfortunately, we ended up seeing a phos deficiency, even though our soil test levels were like 20 plus parts per million everywhere. So one that definitely sticks in my mind, trying to figure out what's going on. And that's exactly what it was. So as we all know, with flax and corn, with the lack of mycorrhizal colonization coming out of canola, that is not recommended. With the corn in that particular year, we always broadcast everything. That was just a practice of the farm. It seemed to work for the most part, but this year in this current scenario, we actually didn't put any FOS down because we were broadcasting it anyways. There was no way of putting it on with the seed. And that's what we ended up with. And I suspect even if we could have done maybe 15, 20 pound starter, it might have lessened that issue. But yeah, just something that definitely sticks in my mind now. Alternatively, vice versa, it can turn out just fine. Canola after either of those haven't had too big of an issue with in terms of disease or FOS uptake or anything like that. Another question, can we still get the variety we want? That's when it gets to be later seeding. One thing we could look at is what does crop insurance look like? If we have a possible canola field that is going to be seeded way later than everything else, maybe pushing the crop insurance deadline or any other crop, I guess, but maybe we should look at something else that we don't already have seeded. So in the event there is a claim, that it just doesn't get averaged out. Now, here's a notorious one because it seems like everything gets pushed out for trees, but we struggle with a lot of blowing fields, I find, every year. The wind never seems to let up. From year to year, we always seem to get windy days in the spring, and I'm seeing more and more blowing soil, unfortunately, all around the countryside. So some things we ask ourselves is like, okay, well, canola after soybeans can be just fine, but how much has the field been worked and how much stubble do we have left, or vice versa? Once we roll the soybeans after a canola field, it kind of pulverizes everything and we can end up with a lot of moving soil, unfortunately. So I've even had it this year where we did a minimal till on a flax field. Typically don't see too much issues with blowing, but it did. It was pretty nasty, and I'll show you on the next slide. But with this, when it happens, we're obviously losing nutrients. We can have issue drainages because the ditches and culverts can get filled up with all this. So it's just a nasty scenario all around. And I'll play here on the next slide and show you what I was seeing canola following flax this year. Maybe. This video actually has a whole pile of kind of morals to the story, but it was like a line. Wherever there was even just a shelter belt, just instantly stopped it. But it's just one of those things that can't count on trees being everywhere, unfortunately. So we definitely have to rely on some amount of stubble in the field. So all in all, I'm just thinking, was there a wrong answer in 2022? If we made cropping changes, if we didn't, if we could turn back time, would we change anything? Well, we always would. But I found it interesting because there's a lot of things a lot of standards that I took to the bank that didn't actually happen. Typically, late seeded fields don't yield as good as the earlier mid-seeded fields. Now, that wasn't in every crop, but I sure noticed it in the canola this year. Yeah, there's lots of things going against it, obviously, but the later the canola was seeded seemed like the better it did. Typically, we'd shy away from maybe even a crop like corn or soybeans once it got to a certain date. This year, it actually, everything seemed to make maturity and everything turned out. So I wouldn't take this one to the bank and say, okay, well, everything's going to be like 2022 now. I don't have to worry about getting an early frost. Well, we all know that can happen, and we're just fortunate that it was a wide open fall for many reasons. So I guess when we're going through this, just kind of in summary, there is a lot of things that we need to have answered when we're doing these cropping changes, and more so when we're making the last minute decisions. It's so easy to overlook any one of these. I still think the herbicide is one of the bigger ones, because if we lose the crop to obviously a herbicide carryover, we're hooped. We're not getting covered for it. And if it's the agronomist recommendation, we are going to be a little bit liable for that. So it's just, yeah, make sure we have good record keeping is a huge asset. Definitely double check with the grower to make sure that what we say we're doing and what we wanted them to do, they actually did, and that something didn't get, chucked out in the midst or whatever. So, and probably don't take what happened in 2022 to the bank necessarily. I usually try to go with the best 8 out of 10 years, or majority of the time what would happen, and try and make my best decisions from that. Yeah. And with that, I don't know if I'm anywhere close to my 10 minutes or if I went at 5 or 15, but yeah.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. So we're going to talk about our regular process first, and then I have some really cool drone pictures because we got a drone this year to talk about 2022 specifically. So our normal process in a normal year, we have really fun color coordinated maps that we like to make. Farmers like to go cereal, broadleaf. And then I'm looking at, this is our in-house records. So when I'm out scouting, we mark off every weed that we see, and I highlight like that farm's driver weeds. So if we're looking at like where are we gonna put oats next year, and we could choose all the acres that we're gonna put into a cereal. So we're gonna be looking at the fields that have the highest grassy weed pressure that we're not gonna be able to control in those oats, and we're gonna avoid those fields. So this kind of record keeping is really convenient for that kind of planning. Our next document that we make, so we look at, all I did was color code our herbicide record so we can make sure that we're doing a nice job of rotating through like glyphosate tolerant or Liberty tolerant or whatever. We have all this data available to make sure that we can quickly go back and make sure that we're not doing, roundup on roundup on roundup. So that's how we do it in-house. And then we go out in the fall, we're gonna take our soil tests. If you have 80, 90 pounds of N, you're not growing soybeans there. So we change your plans. So it's an important part. Important part of that planning process for us. And then the other thing that we have to think about is storage, because again, those guys who grow oats, they do not like to truck oats. So you're gonna be putting the oats close to the bins. So it all matters. Okay, so let's look at 2022. This is a farm. There's a farm here. So we have a farm that I work with in Morris, and he was edge to edge underwater. So I went and scouted his fields. So his farm was the most drastic changes that we made to our rotation planning this year. This is what it looked like after it dried up. So we can see like the soil condition is pretty poor. We had areas that were like covered in trash, corn trash, whatever trash. It all showed up in Morris this year. So on his farm, we actually switched him to only wheat and canola. And then hilariously, we decided to, okay, he decided on his own to grow Clearfield canola, which I personally hate. And because he was like, yeah, Liberty's hard to find. And I was like, okay, cool. And he's like, yeah, I'll just do 2 passes with Aries. And I was like, okay, but like, 1 pass of Aries, right? Anyway, so we grew Clearfield canola, we grew regular canola. We used, we broadcast and incorporated some of that canola seed. We used a seeder for some of the canola, and then we actually had a neighbor who took a harrow and made an air harrow, and we harrowed in canola seed too. Anyway, so for this farm, instead of keeping the soybeans in the mix for him, for his own personal risk management, he just didn't want to be seeding soybeans into June. I know we all looked at the MESC data. It says the soybeans should be fine. We're not dealing with that. Like, we did not do it. Anyway, we were wet in a lot of places. Like, took a lot of pictures of us being wet. So what we did for everybody else, we actually did not get rid of the soybeans. What we did was we put the soybeans in first. As soon as you were seeding your soybeans. I'm a lot more comfortable seeding shorter season crop later. And you're all just going to ignore that MESC chart. That's what we did. So we got really lucky. We had a really open fall. Everything went really great for us, and the yields were excellent. So across the board. No, we had some failures. Anyway, okay, let's talk about some of the bugs that we saw. So by putting our soybeans in earlier, we were putting our canola in later, and we actually had quite a few farms were very successful with that canola towards the end. We kind of got the tail end of the flea beetle pressure instead of that total wipeout. We did pretty good. We had flea beetle pressure. We did spray some acres, but I feel that canola should go in last, because if you don't have time to be scouting, if you don't have time to be spraying, you don't have time to be like putting in canola. Like, just wait till you're done everything else and you have time and you can go baby it. And then I don't know how much this relates to crop rotation planning, but look at all the grasshoppers in there. Like, you could smell them. It was awful. So for this farm, we're harvesting, but at that time, we can think about next year, this field is going to be infested. So whatever crop you're putting in there, you're going to be watching it. And June, there's going to be a lot of babies in there anyway. Okay, special weeds that we saw this year. So this farm has these really great tree rows, and those are really great little nests for kochia. And the kochia got into the soybeans this year, and so for the next couple years, we're going to keep it out of Roundup. We're going to go into wheat for next year, and then we're going to go into canola the year after that. But kochia, it exists, and this is quite obviously Roundup Ready kochia. We put Viper on it, and that's as good of a job we could do. Yeah, so here's 1 pass of Liberty on roundleaf mallow. Did a really poor job. And then showing you all the bad stuff. Okay, and then here's some foxtail barley, but we unfortunately seeded wheat. So my nice little spreadsheet that I showed you that we obviously ignored, so we're gonna be doing, instead of Centurion with our canola on this farm, we're gonna be doing a Sure 2 with all of our canola, because this is 1 year of canola where we didn't spray something for the foxtail barley, and you can see it was a real mess in 2022. Yeah, and obviously it's right next to his farmyard, and obviously we had to drive by it all the time. But like, once it got taller, you couldn't see it anymore. So it was fine. But I did get his kid, his 19-year-old, to go out, and he mowed all the ditches in the field. So we did something. Anyway, that's the end. You're welcome. Yeah.
So we'll get Jason down here next.
So what's really cool, Dennis, is that you assigned us all to the same task. and all our presentations are uniquely different.
That's good.
But do still have a common thread. Yep, that's the one. So, again, thanks for the committee for inviting me up to be a part of this panel. And so I'll make sure, I was told by Beth Martell over text that I wasn't talking close enough into the mic, so I'll make sure I do that. Is this good? Can you hear me now? Okay. So what I was going to do is basically go through the kind of scenario like Liz talked about, where layout, the factors that go into crop planning in a normal situation. And this is not an extensive list by any means. There's a lot of things to consider. And like I said, there's definitely more things you could add to this list. But one of the things I talked about was, the total crop or total farm acreage. Obviously, if a grower is dealing with 900 or 1,000 acres, he's not going to maybe grow five or six different crops versus a guy that has maybe 11,000 acres might be more adapt to adding more crops in the rotation and then helping extend that rotation as well. So total farm acreage has a factor in crop planning. The number and sequence of the crops. Got some guys that like to grow canola after soybeans or soybeans after canola. So those type of things, if you have that opportunity, then you can mix up that sequence of crops. Total or soil texture across the farm. And as I've indicated here, this is going to be, from my perspective, in northern south central Manitoba. So we have a mix of heavy clay soils as well as sandy soils. So we got growers that have both on their farm. And that will play into, the crop that they can grow on those acres too. So for example, in heavy clay soil, he's not going to be growing dry edible beans necessarily in that, but he can on those sandier soils. So it does help with the rotation and having that diversity of soil texture. Crop fertility requirements, of course, as we talked about earlier. Crop water usage, so that's becoming more and more important. Following a guzzler after a guzzler or following a sipper after a guzzler. So if you know what I mean, growing wheat after sunflowers. Sometimes it can be pretty tough crop to grow after sunflowers because they are taking up a lot of moisture and a lot of nutrients with it, so not leaving a lot left for that wheat crop. So, and a lot of that has to come to root mass and root architecture as well, but knowing that crop water usage is going to be very important. Herbicide usage, carryover concerns. Kory talked about it, Liz talked about it. We want to avoid things like herbicide stacking, those type of things, insect and disease potential, and I really should add weeds to that as well, obviously. Seeding equipment availability, where we've had growers that disc drill, single disc drill, too wet to get onto the field, but they still have a hoe drill, so they can pull that out. Or couldn't get the planter going because it's too wet, but they can still get their soybeans in now with the hoe drill instead of the planter. So having that ability to be flexible in looking at the equipment. And then obviously other things, crop rotation gives you risk management. You're not growing all one crop. And then of course marketing has a play into that too. So what happens when the weather throws you a curveball? Do you panic like Stewie here? This is my only picture, my only animation. It was kind of boring compared to Liz. So, oh, by the way, Dennis, 1995 to 2022 is 27 years. I'm a walking agronomic fossil, literally. Anyways, you don't panic, but like the title said, you need to be flexible. So you want to have a plan. Right now, that's what we're doing, putting these plans together for 2023. But at the same time, we know we have to be flexible and kind of roll with the punches, as we say. So in my area, we had 3 distinctive seeding windows from mid-May to late June. So the crop rotation changed in every single one of those windows with a lot of my growers. So obviously, flexibility is key, but it can come as a cost and a benefit to that. So one of the things I'll just quickly go through is these quick 4 points. Variety and hybrid maturity changed. Things like changing field. Chris mentioned this from the Canola Council, changing fields from what was planned to what was actually ready to plant. And then changing crop choice, and then do you leave it unseeded? So one of the things when it came to variety and hybrid maturity was, mostly this was impacted corn, but yeah, if it's getting too late, you switch to an earlier hybrid. Can you get that hybrid? Let's say you can, so you try to do that, realizing that the cost of that is potentially reduce yield potential. But you may also not get the hybrid you want, and in some cases, when I think about canola, not getting the hybrid you want, you may have switched to a different herbicide system even. Maybe you couldn't get that in vigor variety, So you might have to go onto a TrueFlex or a Clearfield or something along those lines. So changing from fields planned to what was physically ready to plant or seed. So planting back-to-back crops is what we ended up having to do in some cases. So, you know, canola on canola, soybeans on soybeans, corn on corn. Some cases we had to do this to try to utilize a lot of that residual nitrogen since we were drought central the year before. But what that then leads to is increasing things like increasing risks for disease, herbicide carryover, and then not even being able to utilize that nitrogen. So we had growers that were intending to grow corn or canola on a field at high residual, but couldn't get that on and had to switch to something else like soybeans, and not being able to utilize that nitrogen efficiently. But because it was a field that may or may not have been ready to go, they had to switch to that crop. So changing crop choice was the next step in that whole process of what do we do now that we're getting later and later. Obviously, this alters or buggers up that rotation. You end up going to too many acres of a certain crop that you switch to. So in our case, I know canola is pretty much that most popular fail-safe. So what does that do? Well, it definitely puts more pressure on next year growing less canola to try to get that rotation, which is totally fine by me. So I said that was totally fine by me. Have less canola, right? Can I get an amen? All right, okay. So obviously when you do this too, this is putting more pressure on things like disease as well. And then the last situation that we had with pretty much more of the western part of our geography in those wet sands was we just had to pull the pin and not seed some acres. So obviously there's that cost, reduced income, but there are blessings in disguise with this as well, because now you have the opportunity to maybe look at, okay, we got some maybe weed herbicide issue, resistant weed issues. Maybe we can put together a plan to help with chem fallow, or is this a way to introduce some cover crops to help with, you know, soil health, or also in weed management, or introducing a winter cereal. And that was the case. Didn't have a lot of that go on this year because of seed availability and time. But I remember in 2011 we had a very wet spring, and a lot of fields didn't get seeded, and a lot of winter wheat went in that following fall. So those kind of situations can be opportunities. And that's all I have.
So Jason, Kory says, yeah, I could care less if I even have to look at canola ever again. So I don't know if Chris wants to, you know, pipe up here at all, or just go cry somewhere, or I don't know, but it seems like there's a whole world of hurt for canola.
So I'm going to open it up for any questions. I have a couple of questions for the group, but yeah, no, we can do it from where you're at right now. So. Okay, I'm going to throw one out there, and I'm just going to throw it out to, maybe we can get another mic here up to Liz here. And I'm going to throw this first one out here. Let's go. How difficult is it to convince growers to throttle back their exuberance for growing a certain crop? Let's say peas, growing peas in an area that maybe shouldn't be grown because they want to jump on that trend. So give me an example where that might play into your recommendation.
Is it because I kept calling you about the peas? Is that how you know about them? Yeah. We grew peas north of Beausejour, and it went really poorly, but we're trying again next year, so can't stop. We are intercropping the peas with canola and with oats, so we are moving away from just peas where peas aren't really appropriate. But yeah, no, it's when guys really get sold on a crop, like they want to grow it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it is. It can be really challenging to do that. So I'm gonna throw one other question out there, and this might be a bit of a trick question, but I thought of it. I'm gonna throw it out there, and I'm gonna see who gets the right answer. So the scenario is peas were planted this year on the field, sunflowers were planted last year. Grower sprays based on your recommendation, and now all of a sudden he's noticing all these volunteer sunflowers in the crop. So what's going on there? I'm going to throw that one to either one or all of the three of you, if anybody has any thoughts. Oh, yeah, I saw that.
I'll
Kory, you got any comments on that?
Well, they're a group 2 resistant sunflower. I run into this on sunflowers going into lentils. It wasn't on my field, but I'm assuming that's what it is. It's express tolerant soybean or sunflowers. Is that right?
There were Clearfield, they happen to be, but that's a question. There were Clearfield tolerant sunflowers last year and they had peas this year. And what do you spray on peas?
Yeah. Well, there you go.
Yeah, and that scenario came up this year, so that's kind of why I asked it. So, Mr. Dane Freeze has a question.
Stop. You don't get to speak.
I got to have the talking stick to speak. Okay. I feel a little picked on, Dennis, because that was my problem this year. And as an oilseed specialist, I should know better than to put peas on Clearfield canola. However, we found out Bazagran works real good. It's not supposed to be that good, but that group 6 does help on a hot sunny day. So we did solve that problem.
Just as a comment, Jenna says, don't judge farmers for trying new things, even if you think it will not work. Remember, they're the ones with the skin in the game.
Yeah, that's exactly. Sometimes you got to have a little risk into that, though. But no, I'd like to thank all the agronomists for putting their talks together. We actually had met earlier to kind of talk about what I envisioned this would be like here today, and I gave them kind of some Cole's Notes versions. But it was quite interesting that everybody took a little different spin on it, which is good. And I think the biggest thing that we get out of this is you need to ask questions of your clients. I think you need to ask those questions so that what you do last year? Things like revisiting your results from this year. That was another thing. Do you revisit your results based on your recommendations every fall? Maybe I can get Jason to comment on that real quick.
Yeah, and I mean, that goes back to just some of the things that, I know Kory and Liz would do is we sit down with our growers now to go over, what happened, do a year in review and look at each field by field and decisions we've made before going into planning for the next year. And I didn't mention it, but both Kory and Liz mentioned the fact of data record keeping, how important that is, right? And that's how you help plan for the next year.
Exactly. Well, I'd like to thank all of you for presenting. We have some small gifts that you will give out to you at the end. We have some housekeeping notes at the end we'd like to cover here. First of all, the reception's in the atrium. I'd like to thank Steve Barron, who is representing Fertilizer Canada and the 4R program for their sponsorship of this event. That'll start just right after we're done here. Hopefully we'll be able to stick around for beverages and some snacks. Steve, did you want to say anything? Is he here? There he is, right at the back. Oh, we're running up.
Thanks, Marla.
You're welcome.
That was like a 3 second. No, I would just say I really appreciated the day. Lots of tremendous work that was presented. And Fertilizer Canada and the website does have a lot of insightful articles about transportation and lobbying the government and what's going on in the fertilizer industry. I know we will hear a lot of different rumors, different things of what's actually happening in behind the scenes. And, maybe if you surf that website, it might bring some clarity to some of what you're hearing out there. And enjoy the Christmas season. And it's been a long year in our ag industry. And wish everybody the best in 23.